Today's tutorial is going to run you through the basics of how to flash the latest firmware onto your board for use with your Mait system. For purposes of demonstration, we'll be using our Mait single board, which at the time of recording is the 9352. You will also need your ATMEL board programmer and access to a computer or laptop with the latest version of the ATMEL USB programming software, which we have already set up in part 1 of our series. The board flashing process will ensure that your Mait board has access to all the latest features. To do this, we are going to plug the ATMEL Programmer into our board. Take the red lead from the programmer and plug it into the appropriate port on your board. The location is different on every board, but the port will always look the same, like this. Once plugged in, open the ATMEL USB program and then press the drop-down menu under ISP frequency. Change the value to either 125 or 250 kHz. After this, press the large interrogate button on the left-hand side of the application. Once the bar underneath the button is green and says interrogation complete, make note of the text where it says signature. In most cases, it will say ATMEGA 644P, but occasionally you might come across something different. Keep that ATMEGA 644P in mind, it will be important later. We can now press the load button on the right-hand side. You'll need to find the appropriate firmware file to load onto your board. If it hasn't automatically taken you to the correct folder, these files can be found in the Mait Dropbox under IntelliTrol, Utilities, Firmware. It is vitally important that you select the correct firmware at this stage, otherwise you may miss out on access to new features and/or remote firmware updates where applicable. This is where that ATMEGA text from before comes into play. There are two versions available for a selection of boards, with the difference being that it says either BL644 or BL1284 at the start of the file name. The one you will need to use for your board must match the numbers seen in the signature section earlier. In this example, my board said ATMEGA 644P, so I'll need to use the BL644 version of the firmware files. We will be looking for a firmware file name that matches the board we are programming, or is as close to matching as possible. In most situations, the number you are looking for in the firmware files won't match up exactly to the number you see physically written on your board. For example, the 9352 boards are represented as a 9350 in firmware files. Since I am programming a 9352C board, I'll be looking for a file that is closest to it, which in this case is 9350C. In instances where you're using our 9352 board, it is crucial to look at what letter has been written in the white square on your single board. For example, C, X, M, and so on, as that will determine what firmware you need to load onto the board. Once you have found the correct file, make note of what version it is on. For instance, the 9350C firmware is on version 65. Click on it and then press Open. Now we will load the default fuse settings, which can be found in the menu options on the top of the program. This will bring up a list with a lot of options, but don't worry, we are once again looking for the one closest to the board that we are using. Since we made a note of what version we're using earlier, version 65, we can determine that we will be selecting the 93XXBL option, as this option states that it's for 9350s on the version 60 or above. In most situations you will be either selecting 4XXXBL or 93XXBL, as these are the most common options among our main boards, but always be sure to check against the firmware that you have already loaded. Once you have selected your fuse settings, various tick boxes will appear. It is vital that you do not alter what has been populated. Finally, we will click the Program button just underneath the Load button we used earlier. If successful, the software will say Programming Complete after some time and the button next to it will be green. With that now completed, your board will now be updated with the latest Mait firmware.